Hi, I'm Hal Austin. I've been involved with the Marshfield Air Museum since its inception, some 27 years ago. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the C-54. We were able to obtain this airplane a few years ago from an organization in Arizona, and we're just tickled to death to get a hold of it. Most of my experience with the C-54 had to do with the Berlin Airlift. Back in 1948, when Joseph Stalin closed all the access to the Berlin area, President Truman reacted quickly by saying we're going to airlift and into Berlin and keep that city going. I went to C-54 transition at Great Falls, Montana Air Base. It's now Malmstrom Air Force Base. To transition into C-54. And on the 30th of November of 1948, I reported Rhein Main Air Base in Frankfurt, Germany, and to join the 330th Troop Carrier group as a C-54 pilot for the Berlin Airlift. On the next morning, I was aboard my first flight to Berlin with a MATS captain to be checked out as first pilot in C-54. So we made 2 trips that day, and then the next morning I was out there again, and 2 more trips to Berlin. And when we got back from the second trip that day, he says, "You're checked out in the C-54. I was sent over here for 30 days TDY, and I've been here 4 months. I'm anxious to get back to Westover, where I'm based." So the next flight to Berlin, I had a new co-pilot, and I flew another 150 missions to and from Berlin over the next 8 months. The C-54 is a very stable flying airplane, and in my opinion, one of the best airplanes, certainly in its day, that was ever built for cargo and passengers as well. It was a DC-4 version used by the U.S. Airlines for a number of years during and after World War II. It was a primary airline airplane. Now, back to my time in Germany. Let me talk about that for a minute and the benefit of the C-54 airplane for what we were trying to do. When President Truman ordered the airlift into Berlin, the only airplanes really available in Germany at that time were C-47s. They only hauled about 5,000 pounds of material to Berlin, and there wasn't enough of them to do the job the way it worked out. So President Truman ordered virtually every C-54 that the U.S. owned into Germany to support the Berlin Airlift. The C-47 carried about 5,000 pounds. The C-54 was designed for 10,000 pounds, but we loaded 20,000 pounds for the relatively short trip from Rhein Main to Berlin. We flew at 4,500 feet, loaded 4,500 feet, and going to Berlin, an hour and 50 minutes, and then empty coming back. We flew at 5,500 feet and an hour and 40 minutes. And the procedures were set up by General LeMay. He was a 2-star at that time and stationed in Europe. And they were very precise, but you had to do what you were supposed to do. When you made a position report, and we had several incremental reports to make, you better be where you said you were, at what airspeed you said you're at, what altitude you're at, because normally, if the weather wasn't too bad, we were flying 3-minute intervals. So there was another airplane 3 minutes in front of you, there's an airplane 3 minutes behind you, and whether it's day or night, and whatever the weather was, as long as it wasn't too bad. So you wanted to be sure you were where you said you were going to be, because you wanted everybody else to be where they said they were too. So, but it was a very simple system set up, and worked very efficiently. The maintenance support we had was absolutely fantastic. We're operating 24/7, no matter what the weather is and so on. Now there's some things that didn't have to maintain on the airplane, but we'd make sure we had all 4 engines working, all the props worked right, and but as far as autopilot is concerned, things of that nature, we didn't need those for the short flight. Pre-fighting the C-54, one of the first things we looked for was fuel leaks. The wings are wet wings on the C-54, and then during the airlift, we were allowed to fly the airplane if there was no more than 12 spots on each wing leaking fuel. Now there are bladder tanks on the inside, but that's where all the fuel is located. So not really a problem as long as there wasn't any more than 12 leaks at one time for the airplane. The other checks were obvious to see if everything's okay. We knew the maintenance guys had checked it out very well. But one of the things we considered, we want to make sure that the tail stand was clear of the ground, meaning that the load in the airplane was positioned so that it was not in proper balance. Of course, we would remove that before flight, but that was one of the key items to be sure that the load was correct. Remember, the C-54 here was one of the first airplanes built with a tricycle landing gear. All older airplanes, most of them, including the C-47, had a tail wheel and rather than a tricycle like the C-54. So the tail stand was very important because it was possible, if you misloaded the airplane inside, to have the airplane set on its tail. And of course you didn't want that. Completing the walk around of the airplane, the important thing, I mentioned tail stand already, then we'd have the tail stand removed before we crawled aboard the airplane to check the load. So the walk around and checking the tail stand, removing that, and then getting aboard the airplane and start the pre-flight inside. So now we'll go inside the airplane and go with the pre-flight to get ready for our mission to Berlin. Okay, in completing our pre-flight, the first thing we did when we stepped inside the airplane was check the load. The German guys were loading those airplanes out around wing. We've hauled mostly coal and flour, although on occasion we'd fly other things as well. But when we come inside, we had the ground supervisor for loading the airplane was always with us on the thing. And the coal, by the way, were in 80-pound sacks, tow sacks. It's the old term for them. They were gunny sacks, I guess is another better term for them. But those were loaded in 80-pound sacks. So I tell you, I never want to meet one of those German guys off duty and make him mad at me, because the way they haul those 80-pound sacks around back from a truck and board this airplane was really something else. Anyway, we'd come in and check the load, be sure it's tied down properly. We'd already checked the tail stand outside to be sure that the load was centered like it ought to be for waiting for balance. And as we moved up the aisle here, and it was always loaded on one side, we'd come up very close on the side of the airplane. The airplanes varied considerably on the back end. Because C-54s were brought from all over the world. Some of them had been passenger airplanes primarily, some of them cargo airplanes primarily. So some of them were very neat and clean on the inside when we first started flying them, but after a while the coal dust and the flour dust was all over the place. Then we'd move up, after checking the load, we'd move up then toward the cockpit to do our pre-flight check. This airplane has got some of the materials they put on board here. These guys did a fantastic job of redoing this airplane. I'll tell you, I can't believe how great it looks compared to what it was when we got it from the firefighter guy over in Arizona. But anyway, moving forward, the bunks, the two bunks in here were very nice, except we never had a chance to use any of them. But they were designed, of course, for long flight for crew rest. And the area over here where the galley was on, most of those were not being used in the airplanes we were using on the Berlin Airlift. Coming up up in the cockpit, sometimes we had a flight engineer. Most of the time it was just two pilots. So if there's no flight engineer, then that means co-pilot and pilot both had to do the complete checklist. So we get aboard the airplane, aboard the seats here. We've done the pre-flight on the outside. One of the first things that sit down in the cockpit was to check all the flight controls back through and so forth, and we had the crew chief standing outside here and using hand signals. We didn't have, as they do nowadays, where the ground crew has a mic. We didn't have that capability in those days, so we used hand signals to be sure all the controls were going in the direction you wanted them to go. And then got around to engine start. We always started 3 first, then 4, then 2, and then 1. And when all the injuries started, we did not do any run-up in the parking area because we were on PSP. Our hard stands were PSP sitting on mud. As a matter of fact, our nickname for Rhine Main Air Base in Frankfurt, Germany was Rhine Mud, because in the wintertime they get so much rain and snow over there, everything was pretty wet. But the PSP held up the airplane very well, even with 20,000 pounds of cargo on board. And we get the engine started, taxi out, and go down towards the end of the active runway and stand in line. Those lines weren't a whole lot different than they are nowadays on major airports. But usually there we'd be anywhere from number 4 or 5 to maybe 10 or 15th airplane to go. But flying 3-minute separation, and on bad weather days when it was raining and actually snowing, they'd back up the interval to 5 minutes. So it didn't take too long, usually 10 or 15 minutes, and you're on the active runway. The flight to Berlin was pretty much routine. We took off, headed for a radio fix, fairly near off the end of the runway. Be climbing to be about 4,500 feet by the time we got there. That was our cruising, and our airspeed 180 miles an hour going up, and at 4,500 feet. And radio calls had to be precise. As we approached Berlin, we had a Berlin radio, and at that point is when we'd call into our Berlin radio. Then the ground controlled approach guys we'd switch over to their frequency, and they'd pick us up at that point and steer us from there on in. Now remember, from that point on, we're flying 3-minute separations or even 5-minute separations. So that means the ground controlled approach guys were working as many as 8 airplanes from the Berlin fix. At 3,500, we'd be let down to from 4,500 to 3,500 feet. So they'd be working up to 8 or 9 airplanes between that point and we got touching down. So it was organized in an absolute super manner, and we've had very few accidents. I don't remember the exact number, but with the number of airplanes we're flying, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and all weather, we had lots and lots of opportunity to lose airplanes, and we lost very few. Again, the airplane was a very stable airplane to fly. I really learned how to fly instruments during my 8-month tour on the Berlin Airlift, and it served me very well for the rest of my career. When I graduated from Aviation Cadet Flying School in the U.S. Army Air Corps Flying School on tail end of World War II, 15 April 1945. In just a little over 3 years later, I'm sitting in the most modern airplane at the time, hauling cargo to and from Berlin. I had about 1,200 hours in troop carrier airplanes before I got to the C-54, and I flew the C-54 for 8 months, and then some after that when I got back and was reassigned to SAC after the Berlin Airlift. But it's not a better flying airplane in my estimation, and I have more than 10,000 hours. I started flying jets in 1951 and flew those the rest of my career, and I did 33 years in the Army and the Air Force, and over 10,000 flying hours as a pilot in 22 different military airplanes. This was just one of them. The fellows have done such a fantastic job of reconfiguring this airplane as it originally was, and the flight instruments are can still be used. You've got airplanes nowadays that are still using these kind of flight instruments, civilian airplanes. Now, these instruments were very good because this airplane is a very stable airplane to fly. I think in my 800 hours flying in the Berlin Airlift, I lost an engine one time, and that was so unusual. But it just seemed like, but our maintenance was that good. In keeping up this cockpit, it looks kind of complicated up here, but all of these things were very simple, mechanical, none of the computer stuff we have nowadays, but everything was very functional. So excellent airplane for the purposes we used it for. I'd like to, with the radio compass, where the hell did it go? Let me start over here in a minute. Oh, here it is. One of the primary instruments we had was fairly new in those days, was the radio compass. And we used that, of course, for our radio fixes at foldovers over our first checkpoints out of Rhine, Maine. And then we got to Berlin, that was it. This needle, the big needle, would point to the station where you were. We called it the bird dog. Well, one night, I had a permanent co-pilot, Darrell Lamb. He was a fantastic individual, but he couldn't fly an airplane very well, so they made him a permanent co-pilot. And he was an excellent co-pilot. So on our second trip many times, you know, we might start our two-flight cycle. We had 2 round trips was the standard down in Rhine, Maine. We do that for 3 days in a row, and then we get 2 days off. So we're making the second trip, particularly if you had started that first trip, 8 or 9 o'clock at night, and you're on your second trip, you're taking off about 3 o'clock in the morning. So you wouldn't swap out, and we decide, well, okay, it's my turn to take a 30-minute nap en route for that hour and 50 minutes up, or it was the co-pilot's turn to take the nap. So one night it was my turn to take a nap and Darrell's turn to fly the airplane. So we were leveled off 4,500 feet going up, and we're probably 40 minutes out of Rhine, Maine. So it's my turn to lean against the window here and take a nap. Okay. Well, he's got the bird dog tuned on Berlin, and it's still hunting a little bit because we're quite a little ways away. So after a while, I wake up and I look across the cockpit, and there's Darrell Lamb leaning against that window on that side, sound asleep. So I'm getting my orientation here a little bit, checking the instruments, and the airplane's flying all right. And look at that, the bird dog there, and the needle is pointing towards the tail. Well, I know it's on Berlin radio, so we've already passed Berlin. So I wake up Lamb and say, where are we? And he was kind of groggy, trying to wake up. Anyway, I turned the airplane around and headed back towards Berlin. And in the area, once you got past Berlin at night, there was virtually no lights in the Soviet sector of Germany beyond Berlin. And so it's dark out there. So we get the airplane turned around in the distance. It was a good clear night, by the way. Otherwise, we'd have been in deep trouble. But good clear night, so I turned around and could see the lights of Berlin. And it took us 45 minutes to get back to Berlin. So that's how far we're out of line. Well, here we are. We're supposed to be in the line of 3-minute separation. I think that's what we're flying at that night. A 3-minute separation, and we're out of the line by quite a while, so I know somebody's going to catch up with us. We're probably going to be court-martialed at that point. So we get back, and I started listening for the airplanes checking in over Berlin radio, and figured that if I can find a little bit of a gap, and sometimes there were gaps, you know, for there wasn't an airplane out there every time to take off on schedule, but most of the time. And so sometimes you'd find some gaps. So I listened to an airplane checking in, and we waited another 5 minutes to hear another one check in, 3 to 5 minutes. And all of a sudden there are some gaps. So I said, maybe we'll get lucky here and we can get in the line and sneak in and nobody will know the difference. Anyway, finally heard one guy call, so we turned in to try to pick up the 3-minute call, called over Berlin radio. We used our hard to stand tail numbers, by the way, which was some short word and the hard to stand number like 91 or whatever it was. So I called in. We picked up the ground control approach. The weather was real good, so they were just following us. It wasn't like in bad weather when they were talking you down. So we went on, landed, offloaded our cargo, took off, went back to Rhine, Maine, and to this day, I never heard anybody say, how in the heck did you get that far northeast of Berlin, and nobody ever found out about it. Well, anyway, so we ducked one there. Another thing you didn't have to worry about, too, is during the daylight hours, some of the Soviet fighters would come up and check us out. when we were on the corridor going towards Berlin. But they never flew at night. The word was that don't worry about Soviet fighters because they don't like to fly at night. So that's my one war story that that was kind of interesting. Now, I'd like to discuss the weather just a little bit. We talked a little bit about using the instruments up here, the radio, bird dog, and that sort of thing for flying. But when the weather was bad and a lot of rain and a lot of snow in Germany in the wintertime, so when the weather was bad, we still maintained 5-minute intervals between airplanes. But if the weather was below, and I don't recall the exact minimums, if it was below 100 feet and half a mile or a quarter of a mile, I guess it was, then we didn't go into Tempelhof anymore. Our primary route out of Rhine, Main was Tempelhof, and that's where the final approach was between apartment buildings, 6-story high apartment buildings. And when the weather was good, you'd see those things and realize how close you're flying to them. Of course, we're in weather, as long as it wasn't too low, they'd bring us in on ground controlled approach. And it's always kind of scary when you realize in daylight how close those apartments were. But you come in over a cemetery also, and we had a short runway. It was only 4,000 feet long, but there wasn't any problem getting this airplane set down on that. But when the weather was bad, down, I think it was 100 feet. Anyway, when it got down real bad, they would direct us over to Gatow, which is in the British sector of Berlin, because they didn't have the apartments off the end of the runway, a lot more room for error, and just in case. And I swear the snowflakes, one snowflake in Germany would cover the windshield. I swear they're that big. But anyway, in heavy snow, it was awful hard to see out. The windshield wipers worked, and they were a little bit of help, but not a little bit like a car, not a whole lot of help. Anyway, at Gatow, the British ground control approach guys, after all, the British are the one that developed that system tail end of World War II. But those guys are really good at talking you down very precisely. And I had one other category we talked about over there, and that was we had a card that we punched for 00 landings, and I had 3 of them during the winter of 48 and 49, and they're all in the Gatow. But the RAF controllers on the ground control approach were absolutely super, and they knew the C-54 very well, the speeds and altitudes and so forth. So they would tell us, and you could depend on it. If they're saying, okay, you're at the auto marker, and now continue your letdown, maintain your speed. The speed usually 120 miles an hour on the final, even with a load. Maintain your speed. They'd say, okay, start your flare, start easing the power back. And about the time you do that, you touch down. It was absolutely fantastic. And on the first time I landed at Gatow, the snow was so bad that they told me to stop straight ahead and wait for a follow me. And so we stopped straight ahead, and pretty soon here comes a follow me with a flashing red light, and followed off on the taxiway. Okay, let's start with the flight engine controls and so forth here. These are the 4 throttles for 4 engines, the 4 props for all 4 engines. And they're arranged with a knob so that when you're when you're setting them in flight, you can kind of manipulate one at a time very easily. Same thing with the props to get the angle you're looking for. All the radio gear is down here for whether you're on VHF, which was our primary voice radio in those days, and then you had 2 of those as a backup. And then the other radio items that you needed right here handy. The mixture controls, because after you had full mixture, of course, maximum fuel going to the engines when you're on the ground and taking off and landing. But in flight, you could save fuel by cutting these backs a little bit to reduce the mixture in the engines. The Autopilot, which we never had a chance to use really on the airlift. Well, occasionally we might, when we go to the depot over in England, we'd set up the Autopilot. Usually they didn't work. It wasn't a necessary item for flying the airplane on the Berlin Airlift. The only nose wheel steering is over on the left-hand side, so you couldn't. it was possible to steer the airplane from the right side using brakes, but it didn't work very well. So this was no-screw steering over here. Your trim tabs for the elevator, where this wheel worked on both sides, and this was for the rudder up here. These are all firewalls here. If you had an engine fire for whatever, you pull this and that shut off all the gas to the that particular engine, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you had emergency brake system on the ground. If your other toe brakes on the rudders didn't work for some reason, you had one pull up here that was supposed to be able to stop the airplane on the ground if you're rolling out of control. I think that pretty well covers it. Up here, your magneto controls and that sort of thing. When you're starting engines, you had to go to your magnetic check, run up at the end of the runway before you took off. Also, starting the airplane, you had to go over, make sure the mags were turned on. You got the feather buttons up here. If you lose an engine, you need to feather the prop. This is 1, 2, 3, and 4 again. Hit them up there. These are all light controls basically up here for night flying. So by way of kind of wrapping up, I know I spent a lot of time on the Berlin Airlift, but that's my association with the C-54 with doing that airlift, and my 9 months total I spent in Germany, and 156 missions altogether, some 800 hours in the airplane. Was very enjoyable for me, and I feel like we really accomplished something with the Berlin Airlift. There's been a number of celebrations, particularly the last few years here, as we get 60 years away from the airlift. The Germans have still very proud of the United States Air Force and the United States Navy. They participated with us too, and the RAF. They participated in their going in to Gatow from the other 2 bases that we had in Germany. The Germans were very appreciative, and they're still anxious to thank anybody that had anything to do with the airlift, even to this day. Well, anyway, I hope you've enjoyed our few minutes talking about the C-54 and the Berlin Airlift, a significant period in my life and in my career in the United States Air Force. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Tom Fogarty. I'm a volunteer at the Marchfield Air Museum, Riverside, California. That's where we're located right now. It's a Tuesday, the 28th of October, and I'm out here volunteering. We're attempting to restore this C-54D that built by Douglas, Santa Monica, that the Marchfield Air Museum purchased in January of year 2002. So we're coming up on almost 2 years of owning the airplane. This is the exterior, of course, and this airplane is very famous, this type of airplane, for its participation in the Berlin Airlift. It's powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney R2000 engines. You can see them here. All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we are again on the right forward side of the C-54D, the Marchfield Air Museum C-54D, and I'll point out a few pertinent areas of the C-54. This hatch right here, it folds up, and this is the forward baggage compartment in this particular airplane. As we work our way back, this hatch here, inside is the main hydraulic system. All the major components for the main hydraulic system on the ground would be accessed through here for maintenance. And I did mention that museum obtained this C-54. Its previous, this C-54's previous service life was a air tanker, and I don't know if you can see the outline of the main belly tank, which held fire retardant. Fire retardant, colored red. It came to a point here and went all the way back to the tail of the airplane. To the best of my knowledge, I haven't been able to verify that tank, that one big tank, held 10 to 12,000 pounds of fire retardant. Retardant colored red and released sequentially. It couldn't be released all at once in one big load because it would affect the center of gravity in flight. I thought that would be interesting. You would want to know that this has been a fire tanker and putting out these horrible fires we have in this area. If you'll walk back with me, this is where the tank it was an external tank bolted to the belly. This is where the tank ended. And I think you'll know we just took anywhere from 10 to 15 steps to get back here. Here's the outline where the tank ended. And that's a big tank. That's really a heavy load for these airplanes to be carrying. Here's the hatch for the aft baggage compartment. Pretty good design in those days to put the baggage, make use of every available space and put baggage in the belly. If we'll just show you the final area on the right rear side of this C-54D with its fire tanker markings. As I say, we're in the restoration process. That will all be removed, and the stars and bars, as we say, are our wonderful flag, and star will be put on this airplane, and the airplane will be washed and polished. But that's what the tail of the airplane looks like, and that's a tail stand installed to prevent the airplane from squatting down and possibly damaging itself. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be continuing showing you the interior of this C-54D and what's been accomplished in the restoration process. There's been a lot of painting and panel replacement done up here. The center console has been reconstructed and painted, and all the knobs are new. The seats have been reupholstered, and all these panels have been replaced. The fire service had this airplane and it was gutted. It was everything was taken out to make the airplane lighter for tanker duty, dropping retardant. Therefore, all these panels were gone, and this is the main thing we're replacing now, color gray. There's all the controls, the glare shield, nose wheel steering, and this is the engineer's ignition analyzer. This is the radio operator's position, and this is the navigator's position here. Okay, we'll just walk backward here now into the crew quarters rest area. This is where the crew kept their baggage and hang-up bags, and this was the crew latrine right here in this area. There were two bunks that were in the process of restoring, scraping and painting that mount. There's two bunks, an upper bunk and a lower bunk, for transoceanic flying where crew members would rest. This is an engine auxiliary oil tank that if the engine's oil supply quantity got low in flight, you could pump oil out from this tank, auxiliary oil tank, to the engines. Just select what engine you was low with the selector and turn on the electric pumps. It's really very efficient. In this area, you could service if the hydraulic quantity was low, you could there was a funnel that attaches here, and you could pour hydraulic fluid into that funnel and replenish the hydraulic quantity. Okay, let's continue on our way back here into the cargo compartment. Ladies and gentlemen, we're now in the cargo area of the C-54D. Actually, that's a bit of a misnomer. This was a tank area, fuel tank area, about the length of my open hands here. There were additional fuel tanks carried on this side, a 400-gallon tank, and another 400-gallon tank on this side, right here in this compartment. It was called the tank compartment. And as obviously they're removed, obviously there's more room for cargo and passengers at this time. These are the bunk frames I spoke of up forward there that we'll be installing when we get the canvas in them. Those are the bunk frames that go back in the crew rest facility. Now, this is an inspection hole. I commented on replenishing hydraulic fluid. After the hydraulic fluid was replenished, the engineer could come back here and look with his flashlight and actually look at the reservoir and verify that the tank was fully replenished. Strictly line of sight. These are emergency exits right here, out over the wings. There are 4 emergency exits. There's 2 here, and there's 2 aft. The airplane could lift 20,000 pounds of cargo and passengers, or just cargo, a combination thereof. And as you can see, everything is also stripped back here. The fire service wanted a light airplane for their fire bomber techniques. This is simply a work area now as we progress on restoring the cargo compartment. Here's the 2 rear emergency exits for the additional 2 for a total of 4. And we just come back here. Here's access. This hatch goes up for access to the rear baggage area in flight, belly baggage area. Again, cargo, 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 or passengers, 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 whichever was required at the time. There's 2 doors here for loading. One door is open. This door also opens for large type cargo. This is the ladder that swings down for crew members to board. It obviously pulls up. In this area was a storage locker. It is now removed. Coming back, this was the passenger lavatory, rest area, which contained a commode and a urine. And I assure you, it will be restored and look much, much better than it does now. Here we are at the rear of the C-54. Again, the tail, very, very close to proximity of the tail. And as an ex-flight engineer on this type of aircraft, C-54 aircraft, safety is paramount. I always like to make a point about safety. And to the docents, the Marchfield Air Museum docents that will be taking parties through this wonderful, grand, stately old lady, this C-54, this wonderful airplane, from a safety standpoint, please never bring your party from this area back. This airplane, all C-54s, if the tail stand is not installed, which is what you need to do when you walk up to the airplane, see that the tail stand is installed. If it's not, and you come aboard with 10 or 12 people in this area, the airplane will squat. That's characteristic of all C-54s, not this individual C-54. So please bear in mind that the tail stand must be installed, and you should take your party of viewers and people forward, at least to the area of the first 2 emergency exits. It's a very important point, and I do hope you'll observe it. There's one more item you might find of interest. This is for manual loading in the early 40s. They had a manual I-beam that attached here on the ground, I'm speaking of, and the I-beams went out on the ground. See how reinforced it is, and with a lock and pulley, there were no forklifts available, they could raise a large item such as a Jeep or a trailer on the ground, block and tackle into the airplane. This door back here, there's nothing additional back here but cables that move, actuate the rudder and the elevator, and the trim tabs on the elevator and the rudder, and pneumatic lines for the de-icer operation. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope it's been informative to you. I hope you understand a little bit more about this wonderful airplane, this Douglas-built C-54D that incidentally became the granddaddy of all our major airlines with their current jets. Everything. This was the first 4-engine airliner in a civilian capacity, and that's just a wonderful thing about it also. Okay, that concludes my presentation. I certainly hope you've been informed and enjoyed yourself.